3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells. 1 minute 15 seconds, velocity 29.
When the Challenger exploded live on television, the world saw fire, smoke, and silence. For weeks, the Atlantic was searched day and night. Hundreds of ships, thousands of miles, and fragments scattered like ash across the sea.
The aircraft and shuttle, much debris that we can't relate to anything.
Then, deep below the surface, Navy divers made a discovery that changed everything. What they found is so terrifying that parts of it remain classified to this day. The day the sky fell silent. In the mid-1980s, NASA's Space Shuttle program stood as a symbol of human progress. The shuttles were reusable spacecraft designed to carry astronauts, satellites, and scientific equipment into orbit before gliding back to Earth. They were meant to make space travel routine, safe, and accessible. Challenger, one of NASA's 5 operational orbiters, had already completed 9 missions and was seen as reliable. The upcoming mission, officially known as STS-51L, carried something new. A high school teacher, Krista McAuliffe. Her role was to teach lessons from space, turning the shuttle into a classroom among the stars. For NASA, it was not just another mission, it was a promise that space was no longer reserved for trained astronauts alone. By January 1986, excitement across the United States had reached its peak. News stations planned live broadcasts, schools arranged special assemblies, and classrooms across the country prepared to watch the launch together. The White House had expressed support, and President Reagan was scheduled to call the crew after liftoff. Krista McAuliffe's participation had made the mission deeply personal to millions of Americans. It felt like the nation itself was going to space. On the morning of January 28, 1986, temperatures at Kennedy Space Center dropped close to freezing, an unusual sight for Florida's coast. Crews worked through the night to check for ice on the launch pad and fuel lines. The Challenger mission had already been delayed several times that week, but by dawn, officials decided conditions were acceptable. By sunrise, visitors were already filling the viewing stands. Teachers, students, reporters, and families gathered with cameras and flags, eager to see the shuttle finally leave the ground. Many had traveled from across the country to witness what NASA called its most ambitious mission yet. Inside the shuttle, the 7-member crew moved through their final checks. Commander Francis Scobie confirmed communication links with Mission Control. Pilot Michael Smith reviewed the engine data. Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, and Ronald McNair prepared instruments for orbit. Gregory Jarvis secured his experiment payloads. Krista McAuliffe, sitting behind the flight deck, rehearsed the first lines of her planned lesson from space. At 11:38 a.m., the countdown reached 0. The engines roared to life, sending vibrations across the ground. The shuttle lifted slowly at first, then accelerated through a trail of smoke and fire. The crowd erupted in cheers. Children waved American flags, and teachers pointed upward as the shuttle climbed higher and higher. Television commentators described the launch as perfect. For 73 seconds it was. Then, according to later reports, a small flash appeared near the base of the right solid rocket booster. It was quick, almost unnoticed, before the shuttle vanished inside a massive explosion. A fireball tore across the sky, leaving 2 white trails twisting apart like an open wound against the blue. For a few seconds, no one breathed. Spectators stared upward, frozen, unsure of what they had just seen. Some whispered that it might be a normal stage separation. But as debris began to rain down toward the ocean, that hope collapsed. Panic spread through the viewing stands. Inside Mission Control, the monitors went blank one by one, the room filled with static and confusion. Engineers stared at empty data screens, unable to speak. A few stood up from their consoles, eyes fixed on the frozen image of smoke still lingering on the feed. Flight Director Jay Green leaned forward, his voice trembling as he pressed the microphone. He fell back into his chair, hands over his face, before finally speaking into the radio. "Obviously a major malfunction," he said quietly, the words breaking the silence that no one in that room would ever forget. Panic spread through the viewing area. Families looked upward, unable to process what they had just seen. Teachers shielded their students. News anchors spoke in disbelief as the same footage replayed over and over. Across the nation, classrooms that had erupted in cheers moments earlier were now quiet. The space shuttle that symbolized hope and progress had been destroyed live on television. Before the crowds had even left the viewing stands, the Coast Guard and Navy were already charting coordinates across the ocean, preparing to search for survivors. What had begun as a celebration of exploration had turned into the beginning of one of NASA's darkest and most painful recoveries. The search that became a recovery. The Coast Guard cutters, Navy ships, and Air Force aircraft moved quickly toward the area where the Challenger had disappeared. Smoke and vapor still hung in the sky as helicopters arrived over the widening debris field. The first radio reports from Mission Control described the operation as a rescue. Teams were ordered to search for parachutes, rafts, or signals. No one wanted to believe what they had seen live on television. The command was clear and urgent: search the ocean and bring everyone home. From above, the scene stretched for miles. Pilots reported fragments of white material glinting in the sun and insulation floating in clumps. Boats maneuvered carefully through the wreckage, trying not to disturb what could be crucial evidence. Helicopters hovered just above the waves, using spotlights to scan for movement. Divers waited on standby aboard nearby ships, ready to enter the freezing water as soon as large debris was confirmed. According to early reports, some believed that the crew cabin might have survived the blast and descended intact. That small hope kept the teams moving, even as the evidence against it grew with every hour. As the day went on, the reality of the situation began to sink in. There were no signals, no beacons, and no signs of life. The waves carried pieces of metal and tile farther from the original site, forcing commanders to expand the search grid. Rescue ships dropped marker buoys to track the current and coordinate the teams. By nightfall, helicopters returned to refuel, while surface vessels continued to sweep the area in the dark. It was then that officials began to accept what the data already showed. The following morning, NASA announced that all 7 astronauts were presumed dead. The mission was no longer a rescue, it was a recovery. Over the next few days, the operation grew into one of the largest coordinated searches in American history. The Navy brought in ships equipped with sonar to map the ocean floor. The Air Force conducted aerial photography to record drift patterns and track surface debris. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration analyzed the currents to predict where heavier wreckage might have settled. Every discovery was cataloged and tagged before being sent to Kennedy Space Center for investigation. Engineers began laying out recovered fragments, studying burn marks and fractures for clues. Reports from those who took part described the mood as quiet and heavy. Divers worked long hours in cold, rough conditions, often surfacing with nothing but small shards of metal or melted wire. Each object lifted from the sea was handled as both evidence and memorial. By the end of the first week, hundreds of pieces had been recovered. What remained was carefully packed into sealed containers and flown to Kennedy Space Center, where investigators hoped to learn what had caused the disaster. Even without the crew cabin, the debris already gathered might reveal how the shuttle came apart and where the failure began. In Florida, a new team waited inside a vast hangar, ready to piece together the wreckage and find the answers buried within it. The puzzle in the hangar. Inside a sealed hangar at Kennedy Space Center, the wreckage of Challenger lay scattered across the floor. The air smelled faintly of salt and burned insulation. Technicians moved carefully between the containers, each holding fragments pulled from the Atlantic. Some pieces were no bigger than a hand, others were sections of the shuttle's body, blackened and bent by heat. Every part was washed, labeled, and cataloged before being placed on a massive grid that stretched across the hangar. Using the shuttle's blueprints, engineers began the slow process of rebuilding what had once carried 7 astronauts into the sky. Every shift felt like a ritual. Teams worked quietly, sorting through wreckage, tracing burn marks, and fitting fragments together like parts of a puzzle. Piece by piece, Challenger began to take shape again, its familiar outline returning in fragments of aluminum and carbon. Each mark, each melted bolt, told a story of impact, heat, and pressure. According to reports from NASA's recovery team, the reconstruction was one of the most detailed forensic investigations ever conducted in aerospace history. Yet, as the shuttle's body re-emerged, one area drew immediate attention: the right solid rocket booster. Investigators noticed strange burn patterns and punctures along the booster's metal casing. The damage appeared to align with the spot where the first flash had been seen on launch footage. Engineers began to suspect that the problem had started there. They compared the findings with data from the morning of the launch and realized that the temperature had been far lower than usual. Freezing air had coated the launch pad and the shuttle itself. Within days, tests confirmed what many feared. The rubber O-rings that sealed the booster's joints had become too rigid in the cold. When the engines ignited, the seal failed, allowing a thin jet of flame to escape. That single breach had burned through the external fuel tank and caused the explosion that tore Challenger apart. When the cause was confirmed, the hangar fell silent. Engineers and technicians stood over the reconstructed frame, staring at the scars that had doomed the mission. Some took notes, others simply stepped back, unable to speak. The truth was clear, but the relief that came with it was overshadowed by grief. They now knew how Challenger had failed, but not what had happened to the people inside when it did. Reports later described how many engineers kept glancing toward the empty section of the grid where the crew cabin should have been. That missing piece had become the center of the mystery. Until it was found, no one could know how much the astronauts had experienced in those final moments. And so, the search was prepared once more. Sonar grids were redrawn, search zones expanded, and divers briefed for deeper, riskier missions. The work ahead would no longer be about mechanical failure. It was about finding the truth that still waited beneath the waves. The discovery. Beneath the waves. By early March 1986, the crew of the USS Preserver had begun to lose hope. The mission logs show that more than 200 square miles of ocean had been scanned with little to show for it. Then, during a routine sonar sweep, something unusual appeared on the monitor. The signal was larger and more defined than anything they had seen before. It wasn't drifting like debris, it was solid. The sonar image showed corners, depth, and symmetry, details that could only belong to a man-made structure. The sonar room fell silent as the commander leaned forward and gave the order. Mark that position. Prepare a dive. The next morning, as the first light broke over the horizon, the dive team prepared to enter the water. The air was cold and the sea was restless. Divers checked their lines and equipment, knowing the descent ahead would be long and dangerous. When the signal came, they stepped backward into the water and disappeared beneath the waves. The descent was slow and disorienting. The deeper they went, the darker it became until the ocean turned completely black. Visibility dropped to less than 2 feet. The divers moved cautiously, following a single weighted line that guided them toward the sonar coordinates. Every movement stirred clouds of silt that hung in the water like smoke. The only sound was the steady rhythm of air hissing through their regulators. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then, one diver's light caught something below, a glint of metal buried in the sand. He froze, signaling the others. Together they brushed away the silt, and the outline began to appear: curved metal, thick glass, and the faint shape of window frames. Wires and control panels lay twisted nearby, still connected by broken conduits. According to later accounts, no one spoke at first. Even through the static of the radios, the silence was clear. Finally, one voice broke through, trembling. "We found it." Aboard the Navy ship USS Preserver, the message spread instantly. The deck went quiet as officers and crew gathered near the railings. The coordinates were confirmed and the recovery began. Divers secured cables around the wreckage while cranes and nets were lowered into position. Every step took hours. The structure was fragile, and one wrong move could destroy it completely. The team worked slowly, lifting inch by inch until the cables tightened and the water began to rise in sheets around the frame. When the cabin finally broke the surface, the ship fell silent. Crew members stood motionless as the wreckage rose, dripping seawater across the steel deck. What had begun as a rescue mission had now become something far more solemn. According to reports, no one spoke for several minutes. The only sounds were the hum of machinery and the water running back into the sea. Everyone on board understood what the find meant. It was no longer about the cause of the explosion. It was about the people inside that cabin. The ocean had kept them hidden for weeks, but now it had given them back. Inside that shattered compartment waited the answers everyone feared, and the discovery that would stay with every diver who took part in the mission. What divers really found. Once the wreckage of the crew cabin was secured on deck, the atmosphere aboard the recovery ship shifted. What had once been a mission filled with technical purpose now carried the weight of something deeply human. According to official reports, a small team of Navy divers and NASA investigators was assigned to examine the interior. Cameras and recording devices were banned. The area was sealed off from the rest of the crew. Only those directly involved were allowed near the site. When the protective tarp was lifted, the damage was severe, but recognizable. Much of the cabin's interior was still in place. Seat frames remained bolted to the floor, some twisted out of position but still aligned in rows. Fragments of instrument panels clung to the forward wall, and pieces of wiring hung from the ceiling. Scattered among the debris were personal items: a watch, a pen, a small instruction manual, and parts of helmets melted into unrecognizable shapes. There were also flight suits torn open by pressure and fragments of safety restraints still locked in place. The site left several investigators shaken. Forensic specialists began their work carefully, documenting every item before removal. Reports later confirmed that the crew compartment had survived the explosion mostly intact. It had continued to ascend briefly before beginning a long fall back toward the ocean. Engineers studying the wreckage estimated that the cabin had remained sealed for roughly 25 seconds after the shuttle broke apart. That meant the astronauts were alive for at least part of that descent. Evidence found in the cockpit supported that belief. Switches had been flipped, and oxygen systems had been activated manually after the explosion. This suggested that some of the crew members had tried to regain control or provide air to one another. According to later analysis, pilot Michael Smith's switch for the emergency air supply had been turned on, possibly in the seconds after the explosion. Investigators could only imagine what those moments were like inside the falling cabin. The noise of wind, alarms blaring, and the sudden weightlessness as the module tumbled through the sky. Many believe the crew might have been conscious for several seconds, fully aware of what was happening. Experts who reviewed the data concluded that the cabin struck the ocean at more than 200 miles per hour. The force was instant and absolute. It destroyed everything on impact. There was no possibility of survival. What the divers recovered from the wreckage confirmed that truth. Among the debris were small human remains, fragments of clothing, and personal effects. Each item was handled with precision and respect. Military protocols required that every piece be logged and stored in sealed containers before being flown to Dover Air Force Base. According to those present, the examination area remained silent throughout the process. No one spoke except to give instructions. One diver later described the moment as the hardest of his life. Others never spoke about it again. For many of them, it was not the wreckage that haunted them, but the thought of what the astronauts might have experienced in those final seconds. The discovery brought both closure and heartbreak. The answers were finally clear, but they came at a cost that everyone involved would carry for the rest of their lives. Now, the mission turned toward honoring the fallen crew and giving their families the peace they had waited for since that morning when the sky fell silent. The burial and the promise. After weeks of recovery and investigation, the remains of the Challenger crew were flown to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. Inside sealed military containers were the fragments and personal effects that had been carefully gathered from the wreckage site. The work of identification was handled with the utmost care. Forensic specialists and military pathologists worked quietly under strict protocol, matching items, recording details, and preserving every piece that could be linked to the fallen astronauts. According to official reports, the remains were commingled, making individual identification impossible in many cases. It was an emotionally heavy process for everyone involved. These were not just astronauts. They were national heroes, teachers, parents, and symbols of hope. NASA coordinated closely with the families from the very beginning. Each family was given regular updates about the handling of the remains and the plans for burial. Many had already held private memorials, but NASA and the Department of Defense proposed a single collective ceremony to honor the entire crew. The families agreed. They wanted the world to remember that these 7 people had gone into space as a team and would be laid to rest the same way. On May 20th, 1986, the funeral took place at Arlington National Cemetery. The morning was overcast, the air still, and the mood across the nation somber. Thousands of mourners gathered at the site, including government officials, astronauts, and civilians who had followed the Challenger story from the day of its launch. A shared casket containing the commingled remains was carried to the burial site by a military honor guard. The flag draped over it bore the insignia of NASA and the American colors. The ceremony was quiet but deeply moving. There were no long speeches. Only a few brief remarks were made, followed by a moment of silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. As the flag was folded and handed to the families, many people in the crowd wept openly. The monument unveiled that day bore all 7 names: Francis Scobie, Michael Smith, Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe. It stood as both a grave and a promise, a reminder that their courage would not be forgotten. At the same time, back at Kennedy Space Center, the physical remains of the shuttle itself were placed in a sealed facility. Access was limited to authorized personnel, and the location was kept confidential. The pieces were preserved not as relics, but as evidence and remembrance. engineers would occasionally revisit them to study the lessons learned from the disaster. According to NASA officials, the wreckage was treated as sacred ground, a place that symbolized both the cost of ambition and the responsibility that came with it. For many across the country, the burial marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. It was the moment when grief turned into reflection, when sorrow began to shape resolve. Every astronaut who would walk across the launch pad after that day would remember the Challenger crew. Their loss became the foundation for new safety standards, new caution, and a renewed commitment to never repeat the mistakes of that mission. But even as the ceremonies ended and the nation lowered its flags, questions refused to fade. They were no longer about what had happened, but why it had been allowed to happen at all. The legacy left beneath the waves. In the months that followed the tragedy, the nation demanded answers. NASA's internal inquiry was soon joined by an independent investigation led by the Rogers Commission, a panel of experts that included physicists, astronauts, and engineers. Their findings were both detailed and damning. The report confirmed that several engineers from Morton Thiokol, the company that built the solid rocket boosters, had warned about the O-ring seals before launch. They had sent memos explaining that the freezing temperatures could cause the rubber to lose flexibility and fail to seal. According to testimony, those warnings reached decision-makers, but were overridden in the rush to meet scheduling and political pressure. The revelation shocked the public. It was not just a mechanical failure. It was a failure of communication and judgment. NASA immediately suspended all shuttle flights. For more than 2 years, the launch pads at Kennedy Space Center remained silent. During that time, engineers redesigned the booster joints, improved the seals, and completely restructured NASA's chain of command. The agency introduced new safety rules for launches in cold weather, and new systems to ensure that concerns from technical staff could never again be ignored. The reforms were massive and costly, but necessary. According to reports from within NASA, the Challenger disaster changed not only how the agency built spacecraft, but how it listened to its own people. The lessons learned extended beyond space exploration. The Navy adopted new underwater recovery protocols based on the divers' work at the crash site. Their methods of mapping, documentation, and respectful handling of remains became models for future operations. Some of those same divers continued to assist in later missions, though several later admitted that the images from Challenger never left their minds. They described nights when they would wake up still hearing the hum of sonar or seeing fragments suspended in the deep. For them, it was a discovery that would never truly end. While NASA rebuilt its systems, something remarkable began to grow from the loss. Across the United States, Challenger Learning Centers were established to honor Krista McAuliffe's dream of teaching from space. These centers allowed students to experience simulated missions and learn about science and exploration. Every shuttle launched after Challenger carried a small piece of metal recovered from the wreckage, welded into its frame, a silent promise that those 7 lives would always fly with every mission that followed. Yet as with every tragedy, rumors surfaced. Some believed that the official story did not tell everything. Unverified reports circulated suggesting that the explosion might not have been caused solely by the O-ring failure. A few claimed that unusual signals were detected on NASA's telemetry minutes before the disaster. Others speculated that there could have been interference or even sabotage from a rival nation during the Cold War. None of these claims were ever proven, but they added an air of mystery that still lingers among those who study the event. Some former engineers have stated that there were gaps in the early data that were never fully explained. Whether these anomalies were simple recording errors or signs of something more complex remains unknown. In the decades since, the Challenger disaster has become both a wound and a lesson written into the history of exploration. It reminded the world that progress always carries risk, and that the drive to reach higher must always be balanced by caution. What do you think the Challenger disaster truly revealed? Human error, hidden truth, or something deeper about our reach for the impossible? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.